good day, adventurers. Today we're going to be talking about mana points instead of spells per day. Essentially, what this system is there's a little mechanic that I created to give casters a little bit more free time, a little bit more caster time, a little bit more spell time. And I just got sick of, in normal Pathfinder, you essentially would, if you woke up in the middle of the night by being attacked, or you woke up early that morning and you ended up getting into a combat really early on, your casters would either A, use up their spells and then be useless for the rest of the day unless they were late game characters. Late game characters, they might be able to save some more spells, but they had to be cautious in what they did. Like, they had to decide whether or not, is this worth a spell right now, or can I just sit back and hope not to get hit a little bit, or can my 0 level spells help me hold out through this? And it's not ideal, in my opinion. This isn't something that casters should be doing. Casters should be feeling free to use their spells and abilities at their disposal to be able to add into combat. You know how you play video games where the casters are being able to shoot spells over and over and over and over again to keep up with the melee combatants and stuff like that, and they're not completely useless. They do have cooldowns to the really cool spells usually, but they don't have a limitation on it. Can you imagine playing a game where you have a daily limitation on your spells? Like, you can't use any more spells that day until after you sit down and camp out and go through a rest. It just didn't make sense to me. It was silly. And I know that in D&D you guys have long and short rests allowing you to get back your spells, but to me that just felt like you were at the whim of the GM deciding whether or not you get your spells back, because your GM's going to decide at the end of the day whether or not you can get a short or a long rest in. So it's your GM's decision whether or not you're going to get your spells back. And I do agree, maybe your GM should have maybe a little bit of say in that, but it just didn't make sense to me. I like the idea that my casters can wake up, use their spells, and not feel stressed out that they're going to be useless later on in the day when another fight breaks out, because it just doesn't make any sense to me. So anyways, mana points instead of spells per day is a way to replace spells per day with a pool of points that you use up to cast your spells, and this pool of points regenerates over time, essentially allowing you to cast your spells all throughout the day. You're still going to be there's still a stress mechanic with it, as in, like, if you are a GM and you're trying to get your casters to be in a weakened position, or you're trying to stress test them in some way, then you just have the fights happen more rapidly, which is going to stress out the entire party, but it will stress out the casters. And so you just need to have these fights happen more repetitively, more closer in time. And if you just want to roleplay your game normally, I recommend that as well. It's not a broken system, but it does allow your casters to not be useless after the first fight. So without further ado, and before that, I just want to say that this is in no way trying to remove fighters from the game either. Melee combat characters play a huge role. Other ranged combat characters play a huge role in this game, and they're significantly different types of roles. And casters are supposed to play this one particular role where they're able to deal with large groups of peons, and they're able to help slow down bosses and stuff like that. And I just want to make it so that, essentially, if you're role-playing a game, because in my groups, we can sometimes take several sessions for one in-game day, because we end up getting really detailed and really into role-playing individual context, or it becomes a really intense, stressed situation that we end up love playing. And so it's nice to know that my characters can cast their spells and not be dead weight for the rest of the combat, essentially being these weak characters that need to be protected heavily, even more now because they can't do anything. Or another thing that I want to avoid is, a lot of my players like to play glass cannons. I know glass cannons should be punished, but I know how to punish glass cannons. If you don't know how to punish glass cannons, you make them extremely risky. You have characters rush up to them, and you deal with them that way. You don't just make them use up all their spells and be useless for the rest of the day, because that's just not fun for your players. And to be honest, for GM, it shouldn't be fun for you either to know that your players are sitting there unable to do a damn thing because they've already casted everything they could possibly cast. Give them their tools. It's supposed to be a challenge for everybody. And so, yeah, this is in no way trying to remove the fighters or anything like that. I'm not trying to make casters overpowered, so that way they don't need other characters around to help them. I'm just making it so that way caster characters don't feel useless after they cast their spells. Especially early game. This is a huge deal early game when you only have 2 or 3 spells you can cast for the entire day. It doesn't make any sense. But this also does restrict it. While it helps out the early game significantly, it does somewhat slow down the late game a little bit, depending on how your character is built. If your character is built, because mana points is going to be based off of your stats, as I'll get into here in a little bit. And if you have a very low stat that your mana points are based off of, you're essentially going to have a hard time keeping up with your spells, especially high level cost spells. And you're going to be able to not cast them as much. Or if you do cast high level spells, you're going to restrict yourself heavily on being able to cast your lower level spells. And so it's going to make players think differently. Do they want to get the high level spell cast off? Are they going to give up 3 or 4 castings of their lower level spells to cast that high level spell when they could just cast their lower level spells instead? Is this a high level time to cast a spell, or can we get by with my low level spells? It's going to make your characters think differently. How much time do we have before the next fight? Are we being stressed? Are we going to have to go into another fight soon? Do I need to make sure I have mana left over? It's a little bit more thought out, and it's a much better system in my opinion. I created it, so I know that I'm biased. But anyways, I think we should get into it, shall we? Alright, let's make big me disappear and little me reappear. And let's bring up the window, shall we? Here we go. Mana points instead of spells per day. Each character gains a number of mana points every level equal to their casting modifier. Mana points replenish every 2 hours without combat or stressful situations by a number of points equal to their casting modifier. Every time a character casts a spell, it uses up a number of mana points equal to their spell's level. Classes that earn spellcasting at later levels, such as Paladins and Rangers, gain a number of mana points equal to their casting modifier every 2 levels. And characters with non-spellcasting classes have an amount of mana points equal to all their mental modifiers plus their level. And there's a reason for why I'd say non-casting characters have mana points, because they do play a role, and it's a very supportive role to their casters. So some examples are a cleric with wisdom score of 18, that's a modifier of 4 at level 1, will have 4 mana. Why a paladin wisdom score of 18, a modifier of 4, level 1, would have 0 mana because he's not 2 levels yet. That's mana for spells, I must stress out. Paladins and rangers aren't without mana, so they still count. They'll count like a fighter, which is an example is our fighter is with an intelligence score of 12, modifier of 1, wisdom score of 11, modifier of 0, charisma score of 13, modifier of 1. At level 1 will have 3 mana. So they have their level 1 from their intelligence, and 1 from charisma. That's 3 total mana. Now, essentially, that same level 1 paladin would have whatever his intelligence and his charisma modifiers are, plus his wisdom modifier, so he'd still have mana, but he can't cast spells with that mana. It's called life mana is what I call it. So there's 2 types of mana. There's spells mana and there's life mana. Characters that don't have, that have spell mana is in place of life mana, or takes the place of life mana for that purpose. But until a character has spell mana, they only have life mana until then. So if you're playing a paladin or a ranger, you have life mana instead of your spell mana, and you can't cast with it because it's life mana. And so this effect it's in place because you can do some special things with other characters' mana. Later on, I'll explain it. Some other examples is a cleric that has a wisdom score of 18, modifier of 4, level 4 has 16 mana. A paladin with a wisdom score of 18, modifier of 4, level 4 has 8 mana for spells. And a fighter with an intelligence score of 12, modifier 1, wisdom 11, modifier of 0, and charisma 13, modifier of 1 at level 4 has 6 mana. So those are some examples of how it works, just in case you guys don't understand the calculation. Now, spells known. Each character only knows a fine amount of spells as described in their class spell description, but the number of spells per day no longer matters. Your spells per day is dictated by your use of mana instead. So long as a character has orisons or cantrips, they may memorize a number of 0-level spells equal to their casting modifier and cannot memorize any more than that. That's specifically for their 0-level spells, their cantrips and their orisons. So essentially, where to stop you from having endless amounts of these spells, especially for clerics and stuff like that, who get to memorize all their spells of their technically they know all the spells on their spell list, they just pray to their god and stuff like that. I've put in some restrictions to put some more roleplay effect on it, but also balance it out, because I know you're probably thinking about that. What about the cleric and the paladin that have their entire repertoire at their disposal? They can now without spells per day restricting what they're able to cast, they're now able to cast everything all the time. Well, that's not true, and I'll get into that, but for now, 0-level spells, cantrips and orisons for all characters across the board, they get to memorize a number of them equal to their casting modifier. So if they cast off of charisma, it's their charisma modifier. If they cast off of intelligence, their intelligence modifier. The wisdom, it's their wisdom modifier. And that's how many 0-level spells they can memorize every day. And they can change these cantrip and orisons when they would normally be able to change their memorized spells. So usually that 1 hour of pray or spell memorizing or prep work that you do in the morning for your spellcaster class is when you're able to change your 0-level spells. Otherwise, if you don't get that, you get interrupted in the middle of the night, or you get interrupted in the morning, you can't get that, you're going to be stuck with last day's 0-level spells until you can do that. Next is Cleric and Paladins may cast any spells on their spell list. Now hold on. So long as they have their religious focus item in hand, which means we're essentially putting a lot more pressure on these characters to hold their religious symbols, and also we're putting a lot more importance on the weapon modifications, where you can pay an additional amount of gold to imbue your religious idol into your weapon or your shield or something like that. It is I can't remember which book introduced that effect or that weapon upgrade, but it's now more important because you have to have your religious symbol in hand to essentially cast your spells. And so every spell costs as long as they have the religious focus item in hand, but every spell will cost twice as much mana. So clerics and paladins must spend an hour every morning praying to their god, thanking them for their aid and requesting more for the day to come. Doing so allows them to be enlightened to a number of spells they chose equal to their casting modifier. These spells cost a normal amount of mana, but if the character fails to pray to their god in the morning, they will not be able to cast divine spells that day till they spend an hour praying. So like I said, they can cast anything on their spell list, but it's going to cost twice as much mana unless it is one of the spells that they memorized. Now, this is an interesting restriction. So clerics and paladins, they still get the advantage of being able to cast off of anything on their spell list, but now there is a restriction to it in which they still need to memorize certain spells, and these certain spells are what they're going to be able to cast for a smaller amount of mana. Now, as you can see, we're getting more spell casting off, but we're getting a bigger restriction on spells known, which I think makes the game a little bit more interesting. Instead of having this large repertoire of spells that you can cast easily, there's a short list of spells you can cast easily, and then you at any time they can dig through the book, find a spell that they desperately need, and then use up twice as much mana to make sure that they get it. So this makes clerics and paladins feel like divine characters. They feel like they are these agents of the gods because they're able to call upon any aid that they need. It just becomes more stressful to their body if they weren't prepared ahead of time to do it. And if they do prepare ahead of time, then they can make sure that they get their ideal spells off without using as much mana. So next is druids and rangers. Druids and rangers may cast any spells on their list like a cleric and a paladin, but they do not need a focus item to cast them. I know that sounds much more powerful. Druids and rangers must meditate surrounded by nature for at least an hour every day, enlightening them to a number of spells equal to their casting stat minus 10, as well as to be able to cast their spells that day. Rangers with the favorite terrain urban may meditate within an urban area. If a ranger or druid fails to meditate that morning, they will be unable to cast spells that day until they meditate surrounded by nature. So as you can see, like the cleric and the paladin, they can cast anything on their list, except for the fact that they get a certain number of spells equal to their casting stat minus 10. So they get more spells memorized than the clerics and paladins. Clerics and paladins get to memorize a number of spells equal to their modifier, while druids and rangers get to memorize a number of spells equal to their casting stat minus 10. So it's kind of almost twice as many spells. And then of course anything else costs double, because like I said, it's like the druid, it's like the cleric and the paladin. They're able to cast anything off, cost double, except for the spells that they memorize. And then they have to surround themselves in nature, which makes them very, very risky, because you don't always find yourself surrounded by nature when you're in certain scenarios. Sometimes you're resting in a dungeon, sometimes you're resting in a cave and stuff like that. And caves aren't necessarily nature. There's nothing really nature about a cave. It's just a bunch of rock. I wouldn't, as a GM, I wouldn't say that a cave counts as nature for you. I'd say that you'd have to be surrounded by wildlife, plant life, and fresh air and stuff like that. That would be my restriction. I would be willing, and as your GM, I think you should be willing to allow them, if they find a room filled with a bunch of plants or stuff like that, that they should be allowed to meditate with those plants, because that is technically nature. Just a little bit of a leeway to give your characters some advantage, but also allows you to put these unique greenhouse-like rooms in your dungeons that will allow your druids and your rangers to get an advantage on being able to stop to pray or meditate for an hour within that room to get their spells changed. Otherwise, they're stuck with whatever spells they last memorized, and that's fine too. They still have their mana regenerating; they can still use them. It adds a little bit more roleplay effect to it, because you're now restricted to being able to use you have to be in these certain places, you have to do these certain things, you have to carry certain items with you now more often, you have to hold them, and during combat you have to make sure that you have nature that you can go to. These extra restrictions are more roleplay effects while giving your character more spells throughout the day. Next is witches. Witches follow the same rules as the druid and ranger, but instead of meditating with nature, they must do so with their familiar. If they fail to meditate with their familiar, or their familiar is dead, they lose their spell casting until they meditate with their familiar again. So this is just a little extra restriction. Now this puts a big emphasis on the familiar. The familiar is a weak spot for witches. So if you end up if you're using witches as NPC attackers, your players are gonna want to focus on trying to get rid of the familiar. And then if you got a witch in your party, your witch is going to want to make sure her familiar is safe, and she's going to try to protect her familiar. And it's an added level of risk to the witch that she's got these really powerful spells and abilities that she can call on, but she's able to lose them at any time if she loses her familiar. And normally characters get attached to their pets in games, or players get attached to their pets in these games, but now it's a much bigger deal, because now there's a target on their back. Next is bards, inquisitors, oracles, sorcerers, and summoners. They do not need to prepare spells ahead of time and may cast whenever they wish, so long as they have the mana to spend on the spell. They still have the restriction on spells known, unlike other casters, but so long as they have the mana, they can keep casting any spell they know. So, unlike spells per day, which was the normal restriction for other classes, the bards, inquisitors, oracles, sorcerers, and summoners always had spells known as their restriction and spells day as a restriction. I decided that spells known restriction should be the only restriction that these characters have. It makes them a little bit more interesting in the fact that they are able to cast more spells. They're a lot more free-loving casters, They're able to wake up, they're able to spell fling at a moment's notice, they're able to go into any situation and be ready. But now they do have the restriction on what they're able to memorize in general with their body. They are more natural casters because they're able to memorize more spells than the average casters. All these other casters are restricted by their casting stat, or being restricted by their casting modifier or their casting stat. But these guys are not restricted by their casting stat. They're able to naturally memorize more spells because it's built into their body. And so they're able to get away with more spells known, but they are still vulnerable in the fact that they don't have as much of a large repertoire as the other classes, seeing how the Ranger, the Witch, the Druid, the Cleric, and the Paladin can all call on their entire arsenal by casting more mana. And next is Wizards. Wizards do not have a limit of spells known and may cast any spell they have in their books, so long as they hold their book open in hand. So now we have another restriction, is kind of like the Cleric and the Paladin. They have to have something in their hand, something very vulnerable. It's made of paper and everything like that. It's an extremely vulnerable item that they have to hold in their hand to cast their spells. Searching the spell takes for a spell takes a move action. Wizards must spend 1 hour every morning studying their spell book. This allows them to memorize a number of spells from their book equal to their intelligence modifier. Like the Cleric and the Paladin, they're able to memorize a certain number of spells that they can cast without having to look in their book. So they do have a small repertoire of spells that they don't use their book for. These are going to have to be very well thought out spells, because you got to think, what spells do I need to make sure I can use even if I lose my book, I'm unarmed or something like that. These are the kind of spells, these are the important spells that you need to think about which ones you memorize. And then the rest of the spells are going to be in your book that you're going to have held in front of you during combat. So you need to make sure that you don't get disarmed, the book doesn't get destroyed, or so on and so forth. And you got to make sure you got backup books. These spells can be cast without their book in hand and may be changed every morning. If a wizard fails to study his spell book in the morning, he must spend a full round action to search his book for a spell. So yeah, if you don't spend time memorizing your book and research and stuff like that, you're gonna forget where they are, and you're going to spend longer to find them, and so on and so forth. I would leave it up to your GM if he would allow you to add bookmarkers to your spells. You'd have to be clever on how you create these bookmarkers, and then you'd also have to, again, it would be up to your GM whether or not he would allow bookmarkers to be in your spells to speed things up, or to always let it be a move action, or to speed it up even further. But yeah. And then last but not least, Alchemists. When Alchemists prepare extracts, they use mana, their mana is infused and bonded to that extract and cannot replenish till that extract is used. Once used, an alchemist can make a new extract, bonding his mana to it. So essentially what this does is this reserves your mana. An alchemist can make a level 4 extract bomb or something like that, and they will infuse 4 mana to it, and then their mana cap goes down by 4 essentially, because it's being reserved for that extract until the rest of the day. So his mana cannot replenish past it. It cannot replenish more than as much as being used. Because his mana is not gone. He's still imbued an item with mana. His mana is still being held and used there. He can't replenish it because he hasn't used it up yet. He's just bonded it for a time to an item. Alright, so some new rules with mana points instead of spells per day. Casters can now both siphon and project mana from one to another. Doing so is a standard action that either gives a character their stored unused mana or steals their target's unused mana. Siphon is a melee touch attack with a will save of DC 10 plus half the character level plus the casting modifier that, if successful, the attacker will steal a number of unused mana points from the target equal to the attacker's casting modifier. If the target has less mana than the attacker's casting modifier, they get the remaining mana and no more. Project is the same as Siphon, but instead of stealing mana, I apologize about that. You give the target mana equal to your casting modifier, and if your target is willing, then you don't need to make a touch attack. Non-caster characters cannot siphon mana from another character, but can project their mana with a spellcraft or a knowledge arcana check DC 15 plus the target's casting modifier, and can only project an amount of mana equal to the target's casting modifier. So this essentially gives you a way to make your fighters, your frontline fighters, or your range characters, essentially your non-spellcaster class characters in the party now have a additional supportive role as being like a battery for you. And so you can now siphon, or they can project mana. It depends on whose turn needs to go. Maybe the caster needs to be able to cast next turn, but he needs mana, so the fighter comes up and projects mana and rolls Knowledge Arcana or Spellcraft check to project mana into the player, which also gives these characters a reason to pick up these skills. Or maybe you have the free time and it's after combat and you just want to get some mana buff because you don't know if you're going to go into combat again, and so you take time to siphon it off of your friends and your allies. And then so there are some new feats, mana siphon feats, essentially to go with this. And first one is Willful. The prerequisites is none. The benefits is you gain 3 mana points, and for every hit die you possess beyond 3, you gain an additional mana point. If it sounds familiar, it is. It is essentially toughness, but for mana. Next is self-siphoning. Prerequisites are none. The benefits is that you increase the DC to siphon mana from you by +2, and you can't willingly project mana anymore. You can no longer willingly allow yourself to be siphoned anymore, because essentially your body's starting to turn into a black hole for mana. It's starting to siphon mana naturally from its surroundings, and you're kind of becoming a little bit unnatural. The natural creatures of magic are not going to like you anymore because you're constantly draining mana, the life force essentially from things around you. Next is Strong Siphon. The prerequisites is that you have to have self-siphoning, and the benefits is that you can siphon mana with a +2 to your will save and touch attacks. Next, this essentially that represents the fact that it's becoming so strong of a siphon that it is becoming more like a suction cup to your abilities to take mana from people. Next is Ranged Siphon. The prerequisites is self-siphoning. The benefits is that you can siphon mana from 10 feet away with a ranged touch attack. You are now so powerful at sucking, or you're powerful at draining mana, that you're able to do it from a short range, that your body is able to siphon from somebody from a short range, which is a huge deal in combat when you're not able to get close to your fighters. Because they have a bunch of enemies around them or something like that, or if you just want to be able to siphon from somebody without getting in the melee distance to them. And then last but not least is Mana Vampire, and the prerequisites is that you must have Strong Siphon and Self Siphon, and the benefits is that when siphoning mana, if you were to siphon more mana than the target has left, you deal an amount of Aether damage to the target equal to the missing mana you didn't siphon, and gain mana like normal. You cannot siphon mana in this way if the target has no mana left at all. So as long as the person has 1 mana point left, you can get your full amount that you would siphon to you. You would also just do damage to them, because now you're literally draining life force. Not only are you taking their life mana, but you're taking their life force as well as mana. Sadly, you can't keep doing it as a normal attack. It's not a viable attack either, because you only siphon based off your casting modifier. So it's only going to be a small amount at most. What can you get it up to? I think I've seen players get it up to a +8 once. So it's not a viable amount of damage, especially at the level that you're able to get it to a +8. You're capable of doing 20d6 of damage at that time. So what's 8 damage? So it's not viable as a damage. You don't care about doing damage. You're just caring that you getting your full siphon. Now this makes you dangerous to your party members, because this means that you can't stop and you're going to hurt your party members a little bit when you siphon them. But again, this is hopefully at the later levels that when you get this, your party members have enough health to be able to take the damage. But yeah, this is mana points instead of spells per day. There's a lot more to do with mana points instead of spells per day. There's going to be mana stones that I'm going to talk about. And mana veins and stuff like that, things that you can put into your world, these different mana effects that you can have in your world to play with mana points and spells per day. I'll talk about that in a later video. Otherwise, I hope that you guys enjoyed this. I hope you guys enjoyed my previous videos. I hope you look forward to seeing my next videos. Again, I am streaming as well on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. Go ahead and tune in to those if you want to, or watch them later on afterwards if you don't have time to tune in. Fully understandable. just more things, just me playing games. But in the meantime, if you're just looking forward to more roleplay stuff, more roleplay stuff is to come. I've got so much roleplay stuff, so I hope that you guys look forward to it. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a safe adventure.